Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and our guest today is Motaz Zahran, Egypt's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Zahran will be talking with us about what to expect from U.S.-Egypt relations during the Biden administration, the stakes for Egypt in the Nile Dam talks, Egypt's economic resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic, Egypt's role in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy and the political process in Libya, and much more. My conversation with Ambassador Motaz Zahran is coming up after this break.
There's no political will whatsoever on the part of Ethiopia to reach any kind of deal unless the international community comes together and supports the negotiation. The issue is, of course, used in Ethiopia in terms of its ability to galvanize the general populace in support of the national project. But the thing that is lost in translation here is that we've never been opposed to development in Ethiopia at all. So we need to have a much more engaged international community. We need to be able to convince Ethiopia that this, in fact, caters to the development needs of Ethiopia without any significant harm on the other two downstream states.
That was Ambassador Motaz Zahran, who will be joining us shortly. First, let me talk briefly about one of the issues that he and I will be discussing. That is how Egypt has exceeded expectations in its management of the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the economic front, Egypt is the only country in the Middle East and North Africa that is actually growing during the pandemic. By growing, I mean that the IMF says that Egypt's gross domestic product, GDP, is expected to increase by 2.8% in the Egyptian fiscal year that ends in June 2021. And that's despite the massive hit to the country's tourism sector and remittance incomes because of COVID. The report credits the government of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi for undertaking what it calls proactive measures to address health and social needs to mitigate the impact of the virus. Egypt's death toll as of today, February 2nd, from COVID is 9,360. That's approximately 90 deaths per 1 million citizens in a population of close to 100 million. Now, while all COVID deaths are a terrible tragedy, this low ratio ranks Egypt 113th in the world of number of deaths per million. And in the Middle East, only Qatar, the UAE, Algeria, Yemen, and Syria have a lower ratio. And we need to discount Syria and Yemen because of the unreliability of the figures. Egypt's progress is both remarkable and fragile. And the IMF notes the risks given the uncertain external environment and the ongoing effects of the pandemic, which is not over. The IMF also says Egypt needs to stay on track to keep pace on key structural reforms, including support for the private sector and more transparency in state-owned enterprises. Egypt's 5-year pre-pandemic economic turnaround under Sisi sometimes goes unnoticed, but it shouldn't. And it's paid off during the pandemic. Cairo has mostly adhered to the IMF guidelines and reform program, and it hasn't always been easy. Growth is up and unemployment is down, and the government has rolled back onerous energy subsidies, which raise fuel prices on Egyptians already facing hardships. And as we have reported here at Al Monitor, continued crackdowns on political dissent. Egypt's economic progress under Sisi and management of the pandemic by sticking to IMF guidance has been a success and perhaps has lessons for Lebanon, Iraq, and Sudan and other countries as they approach discussions about IMF assistance and reform. These programs often come with a heavy dose of austerity and subsidy reduction, which, while necessary in the long run, in the short term can increase the economic toll on populations already reeling from weak economies and now the pandemic. Ambassador Zahran will provide further analysis and insight into Egypt's economic resilience during the pandemic and many other issues, including the urgency for Egypt of negotiations on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, as it is known by its acronym. And we'll also be talking about U.S.-Egypt relations and much, much more. Motaz Zahran is Egypt's ambassador to the United States. He arrived in Washington in September 2020 after serving as Assistant Foreign Minister and Chief of Cabinet at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as ambassador to Canada, as Deputy Assistant Foreign Minister, and as advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on the Middle East peace process, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt's relations with the United States. Ambassador Zahran also served previously in Washington at the embassy as a political counselor, congressional affairs officer, and chargé d'affaires. My conversation with Ambassador Motaz Zahran begins now. Ambassador Zahran, welcome to On the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Let's get right into it. The U.S.-Egypt relationship can't be understated. It's an amazingly successful strategic partnership for now 4 decades and counting. There are reports that there might be some anxiety in Cairo, given that Presidents Trump and el-Sisi enjoyed such a good working relationship, and that the new administration and the Democratic Congress might give more attention to issues in the bilateral relationship, such as human rights and political prisoners and so forth, more thorny issues. Given this backdrop, what are your expectations and what are your priorities for the U.S.-Egypt relationship during the Biden administration?
Well, absolutely, and thank you for the question. You see, one of the unique features of U.S.-Egypt relationship is that it transcends local politics here and there, and it's also here in the U.S. it's of a bipartisan nature. So traditionally, both Democrats and Republicans have supported and continue to support the strategic partnership with the U.S. With Egypt and the U.S., both of them together. So this is a mutually reinforcing, has always been long-standing and enduring. There's mutual interests at the core of this relationship, but there's also common objectives. And when we say strategic, it is military to military, it's intelligence sharing, it is security coordination. And when it comes to the general outlook throughout the region, there's a lot in common in terms of Egypt being a cornerstone of peace and security and stability. So yes, we are cognizant that each administration has its specific set of priorities and inclinations, but these preferences rarely overshadow the overarching strategic interests that have united both countries for decades. And let me say here and use the opportunity to mention that President of Egypt has been the very first Arab leader to congratulate President Biden back in November when election results were out. And we definitely look forward to engaging with the new administration. So there are a number of a host of issues that that will be on the table, of course. And when we look at what is needed here, it is basically anchored in a partnership that is reliable to both sides, that we are able to extract from this partnership the common interests and objectives, basically in a region that is in complete turmoil. When it comes to issues of human rights and freedoms in general, let me just say that these are issues that we all agree to in the objective of attaining a much more prosperous circumstances for people to be able to exercise their rights. In Egypt, we have enacted a number of progressive legislations. We've been able to advance on a number of fronts. whether it is religious freedom, whether it is the rights and empowerment of women, whether it is people with special needs. All this is anchored in the Constitution itself, and the practice that is on the ground is only indicative to the general trajectory towards advancement. So I think this is something that when we start having our conversations and our strategic dialogues, the new administration will be cognizant of and will definitely act accordingly in terms of having this relationship more on more solid grounds.
Let's get into one of the key issues for Egypt that will be part of that conversation, and that's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, Secretary of State Blinken warned in his confirmation hearing last week that talks between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan on the dam could, he said, boil over. And he promised a very assertive American diplomacy in the region to help navigate this crisis. Now, this is a huge issue for Egypt. You depend on the Nile for, I think, 90% of your water. Last year, the U.S. and the World Bank helped facilitate an arrangement that we all thought was going to be a framework for management of water allocation for the dam. But Ethiopia never showed up to sign the paper. Mm-hmm. Help our listeners understand the stakes in the Nile Dam talks for Egypt, where they stand now, and what you would consider the makings of a good deal in the management of the dam.
Well, thank you again for the question. I think the statement of Secretary Blinken was indeed appreciated because of the fact that the U.S. has been very involved in terms of trying to reach a settlement of what is looming as a crisis. The GERD has the potential impact of disrupting livelihoods for over 150 million Egyptians and Sudanese citizens, and would create an avalanche of socioeconomic turbulences. Now, this is an example. We just had yesterday a virtual meeting with staffers on the Hill, and it was widely attended. And this is one of the points that has been made. For every 1 billion cubic meter that is lost to unilateral operation of the dam, Egypt would lose 290,000 incomes, 130,000 hectares of cultivated land, 430 million of lost agricultural production, and 150 million increase in food imports. So this also is illustrative of your point that it is a matter of an existential nature for Egypt and not just development. But despite the diligent and relentless efforts by Egypt for years that amount to at least a decade to seek a win-win solution that fulfills Ethiopia's development goals, which is one that we subscribe to, Ethiopia has been consistently intransigent when it came to reaching an agreement. So Egypt negotiated for an entire decade, but negotiations have stalled at different occasions and cannot remain to be perpetual or never ending. So the GERD is being constructed without having completed the requisite studies on hydrological and environmental impacts of the dam and the necessary guarantees to ensure its structural safety and thereby threatening the lives of both Egyptian and Sudanese people. So for Egypt, in short, it is existential. For Ethiopia, it is developmental. And as such, unilateralism is not an option. A legally binding agreement with dispute resolution mechanisms has to be reached. And we certainly encourage the new administration to be fully engaged in terms of shepherding a process, again, with the three riparian states.
Ambassador, let's just stay on this for a minute, because in Ethiopia, the dam is a huge nationalist issue, and it could change the course of development for Ethiopia and make them an electricity energy exporter in the region. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not challenging Ethiopian sovereignty of the dam in your position. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's a sovereign decision to move on the construction and the operation of the dam. But again, it has to be done in complete coherence with international law, with undertakings that would secure and guarantee the non-significant harm on downstream states. So these are issues that affect millions of people in both Sudan and Egypt. So the need for the Ethiopians to be engaged in constructive dialogue and negotiations cannot be overemphasized.
And you mentioned that the U.S. and the World Bank had tried to work out a framework. So the U.S. has been active. In fact, that intervention began at the request of President al-Sisi to President Trump. And the key facilitator from the U.S. side was the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. So this was a high-level engagement, and that stalled back in February of last year. There have also been other mediation efforts to try to break the deadlock. In addition to the U.S. and the bank, there's been South Africa, the African Union. What more can be done by the U.S. and and other perhaps mediators, and what's the sticking point at this time?
Well, absolutely. Let me just say this: the past efforts were commendable. We've reached a point in Washington here where a fair and balanced document was put on the table. It was actually due to the efforts of both the United States and the World Bank, who have been present. And for long, the Ethiopians have been adamant in their position of not accepting to have third parties participate in the negotiations. But we've been able to do so with the past administration. So that effort has been, unfortunately, the whole process has been aborted by Ethiopia and has been snubbed altogether. And we've been facing claims by Ethiopia that we are circumventing the concept of African solutions to African problems. And we've thought that the argument was entirely weak and not the case. And we've been able to start a process under the leadership of South Africa as the president of the AU. But these negotiations have stalled. So what is sticking here is simple. Is a simple thing. There's no political will whatsoever on the part of Ethiopia to reach any kind of deal unless the international community comes together and supports the negotiation. The issue is, of course, used in Ethiopia in terms of its ability to galvanize the general populace in support of a national project. But the thing that is lost in translation here is that we've never been opposed to development in Ethiopia at all. So we need to have a much more engaged international community. We need to be able to convince Ethiopia that this, in fact, caters to the development needs of Ethiopia without any significant harm on the other two downstream states.
Ambassador, we now, on top of the difficulties of these negotiations, we have the unrest in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Since this conflict started in November, we have just about 60,000 more refugees. And this is increasing border tensions with Sudan, which is a country of 44 million people. It already has 1 million refugees and nearly 2 million internally displaced people. And it's undergoing its own kind of sensitive and serious transition since the former dictator and war criminal Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019. Tell us a little about Egypt's concerns about what's happening in Tigray, how it could impact Sudan and the region, and put it in the context of your own evolving relationship with Sudan, which has gotten a lot better since Bashir left power.
Well, absolutely. The issue with the Tigray is an internal issue in Ethiopia, and I would probably refrain on commenting on the dynamics of what's happening there. But in terms of its ramifications and its consequences on Sudan itself and what we've seen in terms of skirmishes and military involvement between both sides is in fact saddening and disheartening. We need to see much more focus, and we need to see a much more political kind of leadership that is exhibited in terms of tackling the basic and main source of threat that is posed on us all, which is the livelihood of the Sudanese and the livelihood of the Egyptians as a result of the continued construction and unilateral action on the dam issue. So this is a general comment. But on Sudan in general, and since Sudan revolution, let me say that Egypt has been a strong supportive partner to Sudan. And Egypt here does not differentiate between Sudanese factions, whether civilian or military components. Both are partners in a transitional period that we need to see it succeed. And in show of Egypt's solidarity, we just, in last August, we had a high-level visit from Egypt by the Prime Minister of Egypt to Sudan. And we continue to engage with Sudan at different levels where both Egypt and Sudan have jointly agreed on a wide spectrum of cooperation in several fields, infrastructure projects, electricity, railways, and etc. We have provided also substantial humanitarian assistance, providing airlifts to support Sudan during flooding, and also supplying PPE for COVID assistance. So we look forward for a stronger engagement with the U.S. on Sudan as well in terms of trilateral cooperation through USAID and the Egyptian Agency for Partnership for Development, as we support Sudan's trajectory towards taking on the different challenges that it faces in solidifying and cementing the new trajectory they're on. So it is unfortunate that we see this kind of confrontation on the borders with Ethiopia. We're hopeful that this will come to an end, and for us to be able to focus more on what is at stake in terms of the real threat to livelihoods in Sudan and Egypt.
Ambassador, in my introductory comments to the podcast today, I talked about how Egypt's economy so far in this pandemic has exceeded expectations, and the Egyptian economy may actually grow during the COVID crisis. I think it's the only country in the MENA region where that might happen. Now, with the full caveat, of course, that the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic is a work in progress and will continue to take its terrible toll on Egypt, the region, and the world. Tell us how, in these very difficult times, how Egypt has managed the economy and how to even have growth when most economies are contracting, and how that may be related to the economic reforms that were initiated by President El-Sisi about 5 years ago.
Well, absolutely. The resilience in the economy has been a product of these reforms. And despite the global economic slowdown and setbacks that immediately followed the pandemic, the economy has remained extremely resilient. And as we've weathered COVID aftershocks as well. But Egypt has also continued to maintain, and this is the good news and the success story in Egypt. And it's very promising that throughout the pandemic, we've been able to reach a growth rate that is not only positive, but was registered at a rate of 3.6%. And that in itself is indicative of how the economy has been resilient thanks to the reforms that we've been implementing. So the only country in the region, actually, and these are the numbers out there, not our own assessments or our own self kind of how can I say, ability to project, but it's the only country in the region to sustain that kind of positive growth rate. So the economy in Egypt is transforming, has been transforming, and continues to be transforming into one of the most dynamic emerging economies, as you've mentioned. And thanks to these not only reforms, but unprecedented in terms of the intensity, in terms of the also, let me say, intrusive nature. They were intrusive in their nature, and they've been able to make their economy resilient. Those reforms were basically monetary and fiscal, but also structural, and were nothing less than a full overhaul of Egypt's economic apparatus. So these advanced reforms have ensured the macroeconomic gains, have led to sustainable and inclusive, and also with the help of the private sector growth as well, being the main driver of development, and the economy being front and center stage, which we were able to also devise plans for with the World Bank and the IMF. So the business environment has been also undertaking pioneer reforms. So we've carried out in the government some of the most intensive and intrusive, as I said in the very beginning, making the business climate more improved, and the creation of new jobs and attraction of new investments, and to ensure rigorous competitiveness of in the economy itself. The energy sector here stands out, and it is particularly doing extremely well, given, of course, the offshore gas field discoveries that have been characterized as the largest in the Mediterranean. But we've also not been only depending on traditional sources of energy, but we're on a course of also expanding in our renewables. And we're constructing one of the world's largest solar power plants in southern or upper Egypt, in Benban, Aswan. And this is a trajectory that we're on, given the strategy that we've been implementing on integrated sources of energy, both renewables and traditional. So in 10 years, I think we'll be at a level of 50-50 in terms of renewables and traditional resources for energy.
Ambassador, do you think in terms of Egypt adhering to IMF guidance, in terms of its commitment to undertaking some difficult policies, as you mentioned, some very intrusive policies, for instance, the ending of or reducing of the fuel subsidy, and during times when the Egyptian workers and people were struggling, these were tough choices. And in the short term, there were dislocations and people were affected. And when you look around the region, you see a number of other countries beginning or contemplating major reform discussions and assistance discussions with the IMF, for example, Sudan, which we talked about, Lebanon, Iraq. Without getting into the specifics of other countries' cases, because they're all different, tell us a little about how Egypt was able to manage the dislocations of some very tough policies that had to be undertaken over these past 5 or 6 years.
Well, great question. Egypt has been in stagnation for at least 10 or 15 out of the last 30 years or more. And given the fact that we have had in the past reform policies that have been implemented, the dividends or the benefits have never trickled down to the general public. But when you look at today's reforms that have happened, and you look at the mega projects and the small and medium enterprises that have been booming in Egypt lately, you will only realize that these tough decisions, these hard decisions, have been taken at a risk, but that risk was mitigated by the fact that the general populace have been seeing some of these benefits trickling down. When you look at the mega projects and you look at the expansion in land agriculture, and when you look at the housing projects, when you look at the healthcare system that is being completely revamped, people have realized that these reforms have been essential for their livelihood, and they make them better in terms of their citizenship as well. So because of that conviction, we have not seen a backlash, and thank God, people have come to realize that these are essential reforms that are needed for the country to move ahead within our 2030 vision. But also, when you look at these mega projects, you'll find a country with the leadership of the president that has, in fact, embraced a vision for the future. A vision probably not for my generation, or not maybe for my kids' generation. But you'll find in Egypt that is completely transforming. If you look at the new cities that are being built, you will find that not only administrative capital that is undergoing construction, but you will find 14 new cities that are being built in parallel, in tandem. And this in Egypt is revolutionary. And when you speak about revolutionary, you will find a revolutionary thinking in other fields as well, whether education, whether in the religious freedoms and tolerance sphere. You will find this revolutionary kind of thinking completely shared by the people, and the willingness to overcome the obstacles of a dark year that we've managed to endure during the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, and all the darknesses that were looming, and were not only looming but were actually lived. You'll find the people, the general people, supportive of the new Egypt and the trajectory it's on.
I'd like to cover a few of the key issues you and the United States will be dealing with in the region. Let's start with Libya. There are delegates of the Government of National Accord and the Libyan National Army, which your country supports, this week are voting as part of a renewed push to reach a political solution after 6 years of civil war. The country's warring parties, they signed the ceasefire in October last year and agreed to hold elections. Where do you stand now on Libya, your support for the LNA, and the political process as it's evolving?
Well, absolutely. Egypt has played a critical role in achieving the ceasefire in Libya, and it continues to hold between the two Libyan parties. So it's not Egypt siding necessarily with any of the parties. We've been able to host rounds of negotiations between both sides in Cairo and Hurghada and other places in Egypt at military levels, political, economic, and legal. So Egypt is a main supporter of the UN support mission in Libya, and it realizes that there is absolutely no military solution for the internal Libyan struggle. So the red line that we've declared and the president has declared was actually a call for peace, and that call for peace has led to the ceasefire. So this gives you an idea on where we stand. We also here co-chair with the United States the Economic Working Group, for which coordinates issues related to economic and structural reform of the Libyan economy. And currently, the political committee is holding talks in Geneva to address the issues that you've mentioned, and mainly the membership of the Presidential Council. So this should be the choice of the Libyan people, and Egypt will support that choice and will respect and stand behind the outcome chosen by the Libyans themselves. So Egypt here has open channels with both in East and West. And lately in the West, we've sent a high-level delegation to visit the West. And during that visit, the leadership of the West was extremely forthcoming and highly appreciative, and has laid down a number of requests for a much more involvement between Egypt and the West, and all of these requests are studied back home. And we think that the only way through is to continue supporting the efforts to reach a political settlement and to support the Libyans. And we're also here extremely disturbed and concerned by external involvement in Libya And those who have probably gained some ground in Libya need to move out of Libya because their presence has only exacerbated the situation, and their presence also came to the detriment of not only the plight of the Libyan people, but also to the efforts exerted by the international community. So we need to see them move out of Libya, to end their support to radical groups that are essentially terrorist groups that operate in Libya, and we need to see a much more productive and conducive atmosphere prevailing in Libya for the Libyans themselves to succeed in what they're trying to do.
When you're referring to these external powers intervening to the detriment of the process, are you referring to Turkey?
Absolutely.
And your view is they should get out of Libya completely, or could they?
Their presence in Libya has only been in support of radical groups. They have been also playing an extremely destructive role in terms of transferring foreign fighters from Syria into Libya, and that is documented, and it is not an allegation. It is mere facts. And if the intention is to transform Libya into another Syria, then that will be chaotic. It will be another disaster on our western borders that we need to prevent. The Libyan crisis that has been, or the crisis that has been created in Libya and that continues to linger, is our number one national security threat. So it is basically in the interest of Egypt to have a Libya that regains its control over the whole of its territory, a Libya that has a political leadership that is recognized in Libya, a Libya that is able to act responsibly with its resources from oil revenues, and a Libya that has an army that is able to keep the country together and to fight terrorists and terror spots. And those who fuel the tension in Libya need to desist from what they're doing, and they need to come to their senses in terms of supporting what is or what should be the right thing to do in terms of righteousness, in terms of goodness, and in terms of also abandoning policies of hegemony and dominance and reviving history that has no place today.
Egypt has joined Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain in burying the hatchet with Qatar last month at the GCC summit. I assume you are encouraged by the diplomatic and economic progress so far. And how do you see the relationship evolving with Qatar given this progress? And do you see any sticking points still?
Well, the agreement that we've all reached and signed on to in Saudi Arabia is one that captures the general guidelines of what should prevail in terms of relationships, sane relationships that should exist and prevail between the countries involved. So basically, an agreement that is that indicates to a willingness to overcome all the problems. It's a political statement in its nature, and what is yet to be seen is to see the fruits and us being able to bear the fruits. So this will be it's a positive development. Nevertheless, it needs to be monitored in terms of its implementation, and in terms of seeing reversal of policies on the part of Qatar in the past, and that being exhibited concretely in its relationship with our brethren in the Gulf and with us in Egypt.
Egypt's relationship with Iraq has been growing. There are now regular meetings, including to deepen economic ties. Are you encouraged by the leadership and reform efforts of Iraqi Prime Minister al-Kadhimi? And how do you see Egypt-Iraq relations developing?
Well, they're developing in an extremely positive way and very promising as well. Iraq for us is like Sudan. Both of them, and this is the joint headline. Both of them need to succeed. Iraq should be able to be empowered, should be able to enable to confront the challenges of terror and radical groups that operate there that are supported by other regional powers. And the Iraqi government should be not only supported by Egypt and Jordan because we have this trilateral mechanism, and basically the general thrust here is to enable the Iraqi government in a way that makes it more in control, makes their general trajectory in politically in the right direction, in a direction that caters to the prosperity of the people of Iraq, but also in terms of its regional engagements with other regional, in terms of other regional powers. So Iraq needs to succeed, and we're behind every effort that creates the environment that is conducive for success.
Finally, Ambassador, it's always been the case that Egypt has been instrumental in Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab peace efforts. What are the prospects for a push this year? And if you could put it in the context of a few recent developments. One, do you see the Abraham Accords as facilitating this process? And another key piece, which I know your country is deeply involved in, is whether President Abbas can first pull off elections, because that involves some type of arrangement with Hamas. And I know your diplomats have tried to work to help further that reconciliation in advance of elections coming up in May.
Well, Egypt was among the very first nations to welcome the normalization agreements between Israel and a number of Arab states. And it has been at the forefront, and it's only natural because Egypt has simply been the trailblazer in the past and has been the seed planter and has weathered the backlash and has continued in its convictions. So whenever peace openings happen, it is always Egypt at the forefront that welcomes these efforts. But here, the Palestinian issue, of course, and you've alluded to that, remains to be the central core issue in the Middle East. And the conflict is the central and the core conflict. And if we are unable to resolve the conflict, it is only natural, and as we've seen in the past, other conflicts have erupted. And resolving and gearing all efforts towards resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would only lead to easing of other conflicts and for their rationale to be simply extinguished. So Egypt will continue to exert these efforts and in order to find a solution based on the two-state solution, which is the only viable solution. It is eroding, yes, and this is why time is of the essence, and we need to be able to save what we're able to save in terms of a two-state solution. And for that purpose, Egypt has hosted just lately the Munich group, which is Egypt, Jordan, and France and Germany. And the basic drive here is to lay down the parameters of or requirements for re-engagement in peace talks. We also recognize here that there are elections that will happen in Israel, and there are elections that are also scheduled in Palestine. So I think it is important to keep supporting the authority, President Abbas, and encouraging him to continue on that path to hold these elections when they're scheduled. When it comes to Egypt and the role it plays, it also plays an extremely important role in terms of Palestinian reconciliation. And that role has been exerted in the past, and we've been able to, at different intervals, to bring the factions together to understandings, but developments on the ground have always come in the way, and that effort that Egypt has been exerting needs to continue on that front for the elections also to be able to happen. But we also play another role when it comes to de-escalation in general, whenever escalation happens in Gaza. And I think we've been very successful in the past in terms of reaching calm for any development not to overshadow the basic goal that we have, which is one that needs to see peace reign throughout the region.
Ambassador Zahran, you have been generous with your time today. I've really enjoyed and learned from our conversation. Thank you for joining us on the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be with you, and look forward to our future engagements.
We will be right back after this break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
That was an outstanding conversation with Ambassador Motaz Zahran, who gave us a sense of the stakes in the Nile Dam talks that, if not managed properly, the lives of 150 million Egyptians and Sudanese could be disrupted, he said, and could lead to what he called socioeconomic turbulence. And that the reason the talks are stalled is because Ethiopia has shown no political will whatsoever, Zahran said, to get a deal done. And therefore, he is hopeful that the U.S. can help break the deadlock. Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East. I want to thank our production team of Phil Calabro of Al Monitor and Beowulf Rochland of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.